Oh, hi there. Welcome to another update on Johnny's Type R project AllegRo. So last time we were looking at all of the suspension, so getting the Mark III Golf hubs mounted to a new kind of knuckle and all of the suspension stuff. So we're now at the stage where we've got most of the panel workings, we've got all the rear wheel tubs, the boot floor and all that structure's kind of done. Obviously there's always going to be lots of bits and bobs to do, but they're bits that aren't necessarily that important yet anyway. But what that has allowed us to do now is we've now got 4 wheels on the car for the first time on the suspension that it's going to have with the correct tyres. Obviously we've set all of the ride height, we've set all of the kind of suspension geometry which we did on the jig. The car is now off the jig and it's sat on its wheels for the first time basically since this project started. It has been on its wheels in the past, but not what would be its final suspension setup. So we're there now. And we're now into like the next phase of the build. So that is looking at things like getting Johnny's actual engine in, because there's some slight differences in that which we'll talk about. We got loads of stuff to do. So all of the plumbing side of things. So we've got like oil cooler plumbing, radiator plumbing, boost pipes. And then there's also stuff like from the interior. So we've got like gear shifter to mount, what we're going to do with the seating position, steering column, etc. So yeah, we'll take a look at all of those things individually. Right, so obviously you've already seen the kind of rear suspension design that we've gone with, which was kind of like modelled off the R53 Mini or R50 Mini. And the reason I did that is because I kind of had a car to copy off and I knew I could mimic that suspension design within the constraints we've got to work with. Obviously we could have just taken R53 swing arms and bolted it on here, but it would have meant cutting into the kickboard or the heel board, and that would have meant we would modify the rear seat area even more. The rear seats were already trimmed. It would have made less work in some respects, made more work in others. So I chose to modify the body less and build our own knuckle setup, which is what we've done. Obviously it's not finished in that we've got a lot of edges that need to be rounded off and final welds to be done, but as a kind of proof of concept, I know now that it works. We get the correct kind of camber change that we want. And it is obviously fully independent. That's not something that's really needed, I guess. But if you're going to go to all the effort of building your own rear suspension, you know, it would be a silly thing to not kind of do it as good as you could do it, which is obviously fully independent. We've got Gas Gold shocks, which obviously they've supplied to match the front. So these are basically a standard R53 item, apart from they've also machined us a top mount with like a pillow ball bearing in it. So again, everything's solidly mounted, and whether that's something that we end up sticking with over time, I don't know. I've tried to build everything in such a way where it could be replaced by a polyurethane bush if we needed. Like all of these arms could be changed for arms with polyurethane bushes if we find that it's too much. But I think with the kind of 50 and 55 profile tyres that we're using, I think it'll be fine. Like spring poundage is something that we still didn't know about yet really. So basically what they've supplied us is just standard R53 spring poundage. But they fit fine, everything fits right. Obviously there's still a lot of finishing off to do. We've got some repairs to cut out. So there were some repairs that were done not very well. So we we've kind of need to cut those out. Same with at the back here, obviously there's a hole in the back of the rear wheel tub because we actually need to cut out an old repair, do it better, and then we can finish the wheel tub off. And again, there's lots of welds underneath that still need to be finished off, but it's at a point where it's structural enough that I could get the car on its wheels. You get to a point sometimes in certain projects where you need to like move on to the next phase, and we're at that stage now. I just needed to see it on the ground. So there's still lots to do, but you can see that we are really getting there in terms of most of the major components are in now. Right, so you can see it from the inside as well now. I mean, it's come out pretty well, considering like this kind of, you know, the panel work is not really my forte as such, but yeah, I'm pretty happy with it. We will have some more strength added in on these strut towers. So at the minute, I'm pretty confident that this is strong enough in that the boot floor frame that we built, all of the strength for that is translated up through these tubs all along this kind of internal structure piece to the AllegRo shell. Now obviously the AllegRo shell is not particularly strong, but we can only work with what we've got, and the shell is only going to get so stiff. We're just going to come to the limitation of what you can do with what you've got. So there will be some, I guess, some triangulation between the strut top and that piece there, because that will probably be needed. And then we're also going to have a strut brace from one side to the other. What with it being a coilover and it, you know, all of the load, not only the damper but the spring as well, translating that into those towers, which again, it's all 1.5mm gauge steel. So again, there is a bit of strength in there, but you know, belt and braces, better to be probably over the top and be able to take the strut brace out if you needed. Not that you probably ever would, but yeah, so I'm pretty happy with how that's come out. And now I'm starting to think about what I can do with the fuel tank. We do also want to get a spare wheel in here with a tyre on. Now the wheels are pretty big. A 15-inch wheel with a 205/50 tyre on it is actually pretty big. It's like 26 inches in diameter. So it does cover like almost 3/4 of the boot floor when it's laid down. Unfortunately, there isn't enough room to get it in stood up. It's not far off, but yeah, it doesn't fit. So it will have to lay down. And my thoughts are either to build quite a shallow tank, which there's pros and cons to that, and have the wheel go on top of it. It's like a shallow tank which fills the boot floor and the wheel go on top, or put the wheel in and then build a tank which is a bit taller, possibly the same height as the tyre, which kind of fills in the area where the wheel isn't. But it'll all be in front of this rear box section beam as well. So again, like if ever in a rear impact, the fuel tank should have some decent protection from this rear box section. But that's all to come. We'll look at the fuel system a bit later down the road. So yeah, I'm happy with how that's come out, and yeah, we'll have a look at the front now. In the front, not that much has changed other than the fact that I have cut out the lower half of the bulkhead and stiffened it and strengthened it to take the mounts for the sim rack, which we'll talk about in a minute. But there are still some things to do. We need to fill in all the holes on the bulkhead because they're all for things we don't need anymore. So like pedal box, left-hand drive and right-hand drive holes. We got the heater matrix holes. We don't need any of that, so we're going to get all that filled in. We do also need to add some more stiffening to these towers. So we need to build like a right angle section, which is going to go back up those kind of inner wings that I made, like episode 2 or 3 maybe, onto the bulkhead. And we also need to make a strut brace which I'm going to do as a 3-point strut brace back to the bulkhead. That'll be crucial in terms of translating some of that strength back out on the other side. So on the inside of the bulkhead, I've obviously got to build in all of the strength. We can't just keep welding things to the bulkhead and expect it to kind of take that load. It is incredibly thin in places. Like in some of the places where it was a bit corroded, it's down to like 0.7, 0.8 millimeters. There's just no strength there. So yeah, we need to translate all that across to the A-pillars, down to the floor and the sills. That's all to come in the future. But I just want to kind of give an explanation of how we're going to do that, because again, it'll come up. People will ask about how we're going to add the strength in, and that's kind of my plan. There'll be a lot of adding steel in, and you often get people commenting things like, you are adding quite a lot of weight in, the car's going to be heavy, and it's like, the car will be heavier. It's inevitable. But the AllegRo shell is also super weak. So you either have a really light, weak car or a really strong, heavy car. I'd much rather have a really strong, heavy car. It's going to have 400 horsepower. Weight is not going to be that much. If we had 50 kilos in steel, which we won't, it really is not going to add that much to how the car drives. It's a completely modernised car. With regards to like the radiator and the intercooler and stuff, all those mounts are done. We've got the oil cooler to mount, which I'll show in a bit, and then we've just got the anti-roll bar to do. And like I say, I'll just show you what I've done with the steering rack. So we've used an Escort rack, but it's a left-hand drive one. So again, we did get a few comments about that. You've used an Escort rack. Yeah, it's a left-hand drive one, so it will turn the right way. To be honest, we used an Escort rack because it was one that we could get from a supplier. So MST have supplied that off of their, Uber Escort builds, which is super cool. So yeah, it's an Escort rack, but I've modified how it mounts. So I like cut off the mount on this side. Obviously this one's kind of like molded in. It's like casted into the pinion drive. And I've used like a hydraulic pipe clamp. I don't know how well this is going to work, to be honest. If I think about other stuff, like the AllegRo was originally mounted with like a U-clamp, same as our mini clamps. They are relatively basic. I don't know how much load goes through a rack, really. But these two fasten up pretty tight. They are ABS plastic, so we should be able to get them pretty tight. The rack can't go left or right because of that mount and because the rack gets bigger. So it can't actually move side to side. So yeah, I kind of feel like it's probably going to be mounted solid enough. I guess we'll find out in time. I've basically just made out of some 10mm plate threaded bosses, which attach onto this 2mm plate. So basically I cut out the whole lower half of the bulkhead because it was corroded. Obviously it'd all been shot blasted and primed, but it was quite corroded, and that had seriously weakened it, and it was also a bit bashed and misshapen in places. So I cut all that out and put a brand new 2mm plate in, because that's also going to attach to these chassis rails, the lower chassis rails, the lower arm mounts, and again I'm going to be able to use that to beef up the inside as well. So that was the idea behind that. We've still got lots of finishing off and tidying up to do. These are some of the areas that I was really struggling to get at when the car was on the jig. So now that it's off the jig, I can get a lot of this tidied up and begin to kind of do final welds, which is, yeah, it's nice and exciting. The plan for an anti-roll bar is to be able to mount that just there on those like lower chassis rails as well. But I'm holding off on doing that because we obviously do need an anti-roll bar, but it's one of those things that it could work in other orientations. Like it could actually work inside the car. There's a few places we could put it. We can put bends in it and things like that. It's something that we can come to after. So that's why I'm just leaving it loose in there, just to remind me that's where it's going to go. But yeah, we're getting there with all this stuff now. So hopefully next time you see it, it'll all have the final welds done. It'll be looking pretty. Right, so that's the engine in. We have got a bit more sump clearance as planned, so that's worked out nicely. We've got the 5 inches that I said we was probably going to have. Now, obviously, whether the car ends up being a bit lower or a bit higher, I'm not sure yet. Johnny is still to see the car with its kind of weight of the engine in, so that'll be for him to decide. But yeah, it's in, as expected. We've obviously got some nice new parts, more parts from T7. We've got this blank for the end of the cylinder head, which is going to take the radiator hose. We've also got a Craig Davies water pump. That's going to mount just under the inlet manifold, I think, so it'll kind of be out of sight when it's kind of in the car, but yeah, that's the plan for that. That'll sit under the inlet manifold. And they've also supplied us a blank for the breather port on the end of the cylinder head, which is specific to the Z4 engine. I'm not sure if they're going to put that into production or not, but obviously it was vital to allow us to fit this inlet manifold onto a Z4 cylinder head. So yeah, that's worked out lovely. So we got a Setrab oil cooler from T7 Design. And fortunately, as I kind of planned, it does fit in this location behind the grille perfectly. And there's actually already holes in this front panel for some reason, like OEM holes, which almost perfectly line up with the oil cooler lines. So my plan is to have some mounts which either weld on or bolt onto the intercooler core to actually take this oil cooler, and then the lines will run down kind of in front of the intercooler towards the engine. One thing I didn't know is that these are actually made in Europe, which is really cool. I'd always rather use like made in the UK or made in Europe parts where I can. You know, stop sending your money to communist countries and all that. Right, so yeah, it's cool to finally see it outside on the ground. It's the first time I've seen it at ride height. I mean, I would like to say it looks cool, but to me it just looks like a low AllegRo with the wrong size wheels on. But yeah, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.